ahead and get started. Excuse me, Francis. During the German genocide, we were talking about de-individuation, and of course, we talked about the rape of Nanking. It's the first time that we had seen that in a long time. World War I, we didn't see any type of, well, not that kind of massacre, not one that people admitted. There was a massacre of the Armenians in Turkey, in the Ottoman Empire, but they still deny it. So, but the Nazis, it's really hard for them to deny any of this stuff. They tried to kill off all the European Jews. Really kind of interesting. They started out shooting them, and then they realized that they were wasting too many bullets. So they were looking for another method of doing it. They decided that they would gas them. And then they were piling up all these bodies, and they couldn't figure out what to do with all the bodies, and so then they decided just to cremate them all. And it created quite a mess. But there are some ugly pictures, so if you don't want to look, don't look. Some of the stuff that they did, they piled them up like cordwood. They did all kinds of interesting experiments with them. Since they weren't human, they didn't consider them human. Okay, well, so as we know, people perform in groups what they would not have the social support to do alone, and this, of course, is known as de-individuation. Let me sign everybody in. There we go. There we go. There we go. Okay. And de-individuation is a loss of self-awareness and evaluation of apprehension. It occurs in group situations that foster responsiveness to group norms, good or bad, and that's known as de-individuation. Teams will cheat. Players that wouldn't cheat by themselves, when they get onto a team, they may cheat. I saw this when I was coaching soccer. I was really shocked, because I thought, you know, soccer's a game, right? Well, it turns out that some people think of it as far more serious than a game. And they'll do anything to win. We were playing against a group of guys from Nicaragua. No, Costa Rica. Anyway, there were these little Indian guys, and they were tiny. They were like 5 feet tall. But they were good, and they were fast, and they were kicking us all over the field. We scored a goal, and then all of a sudden, everybody got taken down. Our team, I mean, we were losing what, 3-0, and here all of a sudden we scored a goal, so it was 3-1, and they took everybody out. I mean, they took everybody as punishment for scoring a goal, which is ill. I mean, it's not really. We were supposed to do that, but they were punishing us for actually scoring. They won the game like 19-3 or something. It was horrible. They were beating us all over the field, but they punished us all. I mean, they took us down from behind, and of course, they called. Everybody got a yellow card. It wasn't that big a deal, but nobody got kicked out of the game. Anyway, so you'll do things as a group that you would not do all by yourself. A group has the power not only to arouse its members, but also to render them unidentifiable. It is the group's action, not the individual's action, and of course that is the individuation. More pictures of dead people, so be careful what you're looking at. Brian Mullen content analyzed newspaper accounts of 60 lynchings committed in the United States between 1899 in 1946, and discovered an interesting fact. The more people there were in the mob, the greater the savagery and the viciousness with which they killed their victims. And of course, as we...
Lynch mob?
Lynch mobs. Right. Yeah, this was a really serious problem in the United States that we gloss over now. We try to pretend that these things aren't happen or didn't happen in the past, but the reality was, if you were an African American, especially if you were an African American in the South, the probability of you being lynched was fairly high, and it didn't have to be in the South. There was a lynching in Omaha, Nebraska, in 1917 that just aroused everybody. Everybody was pissed off. there were riots in the street afterwards. And most of the riots were white people trying to destroy black businesses. That was what the riot was all about. And it was a black man that was lynched. So it really didn't have to take place in the South. It potentially could have taken place anyplace else. There was a lynching in Indiana in the 1920s. 3 individuals theoretically raped this lady. She was raped, and she was raped by one of those guys, but it was one of those guys, and they actually lynched 2 guys. And there was a third that they almost lynched, but he didn't have anything to do with it. He just happened to be an African American in the area when they were pissed off. And so he was almost lynched. So this was a really serious problem in the United States, and it didn't end until World War II. And it didn't even end during World War II. I mean, this was a problem. This is a problem that we were ignoring. They were trying to support anti-lynching laws in Congress, and they wouldn't pass an anti-lynching law. As ugly as that is, we still don't have an anti-lynching law on the books. So this could all erupt again. So there was a lot of stuff taking place in the United States that people were ignoring or pretending wasn't happening. So I lived in Mississippi in the 1990s. The last lynching they had in the county that I was living in was 1976, where a man was dating a white woman. This is in 1976. It was against the law at that time. This is known as miscegenation. It was against the law. It was also against their culture. And they found the guy pinned to a tree, nailed to a tree, in the middle of this town right beside where I was living, as ugly as that is. And he was dead, of course. He was dead before they nailed him up, which I don't know if that makes sense better or not. But anyway, he was nailed to the tree as a crucifix. You know, that's ugly stuff. Ugly stuff. Okay, so why in the world are people willing to do this? One of the things that they discovered, Robert Watson, he studied 24 cultures and found that warriors who hid their identities before going into battle, for example, by using face paint or body paint, were significantly more likely to kill, torture, or mutilate captive prisoners than warriors who did not hide their identities. And of course, if you watch movies, and this is fairly obvious, that these are the individuals that you're afraid of. It's not the person that you can identify. It's a person that is covered. This person, well, Darth Vader is a good example. He's a perfect example. Anyway, far more dangerous than individuals that will allow you to find out who they are. The robes and hoods of the Ku Klux Klan cloak its members in anonymity. Their violent behavior is consistent with research on deindividuation, of course, as ugly as that is. Lynch mobs lynch with impunity. Rioters in a faceless mob will loot. Large crowds of people around a suicide jumper will bait and jeer them to jump. I had a guy that knocked on my door asking to borrow money this morning. Evidently, his cousin hung himself. His cousin brother hung himself. He needs gas money to go out and get yucca plants or something. It was kind of an interesting. At 7 o'clock in the morning, someone knocks on my door. Oh man, I'm broke. Just in case anybody's looking for some. Yeah, exactly. Of course, the dog went berserk. Anyway, so what's going on? Okay, so we're lynching people, or what are we doing? We're rioting. Large crowds of people. I was talking about the suicide jump. People in crowded cities are more likely to loot and vandalize than people in small, less crowded cities. People in cities are not as nice as people who live in rural areas. My daughter lived in the highly crowded area of Florida, and she comments almost daily on how polite people in Iowa are. Well, the reality is people in Iowa aren't any more polite than people in Montana or Wyoming or wherever, but it's just that they look you in the face, and when people look you in the face, they're more likely to be polite.
Did you see that? And it made Fox News, Missoula. There was a lady, these two Native American girls going to the Peter Pit, and there was a girl, she's like an activist, you know, she's all about green and everything. Well, anyway, these two girls go in there and she spits in their sandwich.
Ah!
And one would just happen to be recording it because she was sending it to her boyfriend.
Right.
And she recorded it. She was like, "Oh my God, oh my God." So she posted it on Facebook and all these other things, and it got like 100 and some thousand hits on YouTube. And so Fox News got a hold of it and they played it, and now that girl got fired. She got charged and everything.
I would hope so.
Yeah, and so now they're calling it Peter Spit.
Oh man, that's ugly. Okay, wow. Why would somebody do something like that? It doesn't even make sense. Okay. That's nasty. Peter Spit. Are you grossed out? No, not yet? Okay, wait, just wait. It gets better. Deindividuation does not require face-to-face contact. For example, feeling less inhibited on social media. That's anonymous, of course, and this is one of the reasons why people troll so much on the internet. They've got their identity hidden, so they can say all kinds of horrible, ugly, nasty, horrible things. Cyberspace provides advantages for the free and open discussion of difficult topics, but the cost seems to be a reduction in common civility, and of course that's what happened during the last election. It doesn't seem to be getting any better. People are still attacking one another for their ideas. We're not allowed to have differing ideas, evidently. We have to agree with whoever the troll is. And of course, that was what the Russian trolls were using against us. So maybe it wasn't so much. Well, it was. I was interacting with people that I knew, and of course, we were not. I wasn't insulting, but they were insulting me, telling me that I was. Kept calling me a libtard, which retarded liberal. That's what it's short for retarded liberal. So. That seemed a little much. I wasn't calling them fascists, not very often anyway. From time to time. Anyway, the phenomenon of the internet troll is a modern example of de-individuation made possible by the feelings of anonymity that often go along with being online. And of course, they just had a huge blow up about trolls. Evidently, the Russian trolls, the Obama administration could have stopped the trolling. That's what they said. That it was the Obama administration's fault that all this was taking place. January of 2006, the Washington Post had to temporarily shut down its website Postblog after the site was deluged with postings from angry readers, many of whom wrote obscene or insulting comments that they had to erase because they were so nasty. The flap was over a claim by the Washington Post reporter that admitted felon Jack Abramoff had made substantial campaign contributions to both major parties, making it sound as if he was equally giving to the Republicans and the Democrats. As it turned out, almost all of his, it was like 90% of all of his contributions were to the Republican Party, and he was mostly a Republican hack, but of course, and he did make contributions to the Democrats, but it was to the more conservative Democrats. The Post later published a correction noting that Abramoff had contributed almost exclusively to the Republican Party, but not before their website was flooded with responses not fit for family newspapers, mostly from Democrats who were really pissed off. And they were showing the fact, and they were swearing or using really nasty words, but of course they were able to hide their identities by using a hashtag or whatever. I don't understand how that stuff works. Anyway, you can hide your identity, can't you? You don't need to tell people who you are. You can use you can open up a new Twitter account or something and call yourself, you know, Hummingbird or whatever. Can't you? I think that's what I did. Okay. Okay, so let's solve some problems here. Groups will do well only if the most talented member can convince the others that he or she is right. And of course, that doesn't always happen. It's not always easy, given that many of us bear a strong resemblance to mules when it comes to admitting that we are wrong. People won't admit that they're wrong. People will support themselves despite the fact that their ideas are not as good as other people's ideas. And of course, we are kind of like mules. We are kind of bullheaded. It's kind of hard for us to admit that we're wrong. You undoubtedly know what it's like to try to convince a group to follow your idea, to be faced with opposition and disbelief, and then have to sit there and watch the group make the wrong decision over and over and over again. Of course, right now we're debating as to what direction the psychology program should take. Unfortunately, both Sarah and I have dug in our heels about what we think, so we'll see what happens in the future. It looks like things are going to, we're going to change. I want to change the program. She wants to keep the program the way it is, so we'll see what happens. Wish me luck. I want more counseling classes. She wants more research classes, so we'll see what happens. But I mean, that's the situation that we're in. We get into a meeting and all of a sudden we start talking back and forth, and neither of us are listening to the other one, and of course it's a very non-productive. So we'll see what happens. Right now we're staying away from one another, so it'll all work itself out in the end. Process loss is any aspect of group interaction that inhibits good problem solving. In some groups, people don't listen to each other, and that's what's happening with Sarah and I. We're not listening to one another. One person is allowed to dominate the discussion while the others tune it out, and of course that happens in meetings as well. And like I said, we haven't had a meeting since the end of last semester. I mean, we haven't even talked to each other since the end of last semester, so this should be interesting. Yeah, okay. Process loss can occur for a number of reasons. Groups might not try hard enough to find out who the most competent member is, or the one with the best ideas. They may just go to the tallest guy or the best looking person. You know, it's really odd how groups determine who the leader should be. The most competent member might find it difficult to disagree with everyone else. You may have somebody with good ideas that doesn't want to push their ideas because their ideas are different from other people. And of course, they don't want to make any waves. And because of that, of course, that's normally what will happen. Communication problems can arise between individuals. Males won't want to talk to females. Females won't want to talk to males because the males are too domineering, or there a lot of times what will happen is that males will speak over females, and because they have louder voices, and because they're taller. Yeah, okay. And then we have cultures that tell you that men are supposed to be in charge. All the major religions say that men are supposed to be in charge. That's interesting as that is. Do you know that? Think about it. Where was I? I was in Oklahoma City. Oklahoma City is where the Southern Baptist headquarters is. I'm sure all of you knew that. It's a huge building. It's about the size of that mountain over there. It's huge. This building is gigantic. It looks like a spaceship. So every year they have the Southern Baptist Conference comes in. And if you know anything about Baptists, does anybody know anything about Baptists? Only men can preach to Baptists. Women can't preach. So Billy Graham, of course, Billy Graham, who just died. Billy Graham is highly very highly thought of in the Baptist church. And his daughter came. He started suffering from Parkinson's disease about 20 years ago. He's been going downhill ever since. But he couldn't go to the conference, so he sent his daughter with a message for the people at the conference. But unfortunately, because she's female, she couldn't address the entire conference because women aren't allowed to preach to men. Only men can preach to men. As ugly and strange as that is. So here's this lady with this message from this iconic figure that's been an evangelist since the 1940s, and she's not allowed to present her material to the conference. So what they did was men will go to these conferences with their wives. So she had a meeting with all the wives, and she told them what Billy wanted everybody to know, and then the wives went and told their husbands. It was the dumbest thing in the world. She can't even talk to men. Come on, let's get to it. Anyway, I know. I'm kind of down on religion sometimes. A lot of them don't.
They see some religion in that race with the men and the women.
Yeah. Well, we don't want to, talk to each other. That would be terrible. Anyway, okay, all you Baptists out there are just insulted. And Edison's in the back writing me up right now. I can see him typing on his email. Okay. Sorry. Anyway, I thought it was funny. And the whole deal was, it was in the newspaper every day. They knew that she was coming, and of course, if you're not a Baptist, you're going, well, let her talk. Everybody else is going, let her talk. All the Methodists are screaming to let her talk. And the Baptists, there's like 1,000 different types of Baptists: Free Will Baptist and American Baptist, and so there's just a ton of them. Anyway, and they were all screaming to let her talk. It was really kind of funny. Or not funny at all. But every day we got to see about it. She's a very attractive woman. And maybe that had something to do with it as well. The fact that she's real tall and slender. Anyway, not important. Why are we talking about this? Whose fault is this? It must be mine. Groups tend to focus on the information they share and ignore facts known to only some members of the group. And for that reason, if everybody doesn't know this information, then they won't accept it. This is one of the reasons why, if you've ever been on a committee or in a group, a lot of times they will send you the agenda and they will send you information. Or people will say, this is what I want to talk about and this is the information that I have. So that everybody has the same information going into the meeting. If everybody doesn't have the same information, then you can't they won't discuss it at the meeting. It has to be completely disseminated to all the people in the group. Subsequent research has focused on ways to get groups to focus more on unshared information. Group discussions should last long enough to get beyond what everyone already knows. Assign different group members to specific areas of expertise so that they know that they alone are responsible for certain types of information. And of course that can help you disseminate information. I'm on the committee, and one of the individuals on the committee keeps speaking Navajo, and I'm the guy taking notes. So have this long 5-minute conversation in Navajo. Of course, I don't speak Navajo, so I'm just sitting there going, "Oh, I do not," and I have no idea what he said. And so then, the person in charge. Oh, it's my wife. Hello? Oh, okay, good, thanks. Okay, okay. Love you too. Bye. She sent me an email. Ooh, naked pictures. No, I'm just kidding. No, I wish. Wait a minute, now I've lost my train of thought. What was I talking about? Oh, man. Actually, they're pictures of me when I was running track in high school. I know. Why in the world do I need those? Transactive memory is the combined memory of two people that is more efficient than the memory of either individual. I remember it from one perspective, somebody else remembers the same information from another perspective. So if we put the two together, that information becomes even more than it would have been if from my perspective or from the other perspective. By learning to specialize their memories and knowing what their partner is responsible for, couples often do quite well in remembering important information. And this is one of the things that happens in married couples. The one individual is more interested in one aspect, and then the other individual is more interested in another aspect. So you'll have one that thinks about money, and the other one thinks about feelings or something, you know, one of those kind of deals. So together they make a whole, but apart, of course, my dad used to do that. My dad was a banker, so everything was money. I mean, so if he gave you a present, it was a check. You know, he never bought you anything. It was always a check. But my mother, she hated that. She just hated the fact that he's given out all this money. So she would do something like buy you a tie, you know, it was that kind of a deal. So I've got all these ties from my mother, and I've got all these envelopes, money envelopes from my dad. But together, of course, it was kind of cute, the two of them. And of course, anytime he gave away money, my mother would growl at him, you know. And my mother could growl. She's worse than a bear. She's pretty growly. The same can be true of groups of strangers. If they develop a system whereby different people are responsible for remembering different parts of the task, then they are more likely to get everything done. Let's see. Okay, let's talk about groupthink. Groupthink is always kind of interesting. This is something that happens in politics a lot, unfortunately, because people will become acolytes. They will become individuals that are following this group. So they won't want to argue against it. That's what's happening right now. That's what's happening right now. We just switched from the first African-American president to Donald Trump. And Donald Trump, of course, is very controversial, is relatively controversial. He's also relatively conservative, so he's being supported by a select news outlet. Well, it's Fox News, I can say that. If you were watching Fox News during the Obama administration, they became an attack group. I mean, they attacked, Obama did nothing right, as far as they were concerned. And now, of course, Donald Trump does nothing wrong, which is really kind of interesting. So it's a little bit easier to attack somebody than it is to support somebody, as it turns out. And that's what we're learning. CNN, of course, and MSNBC were very much in favor of what was going on with Barack Obama. But now that Donald Trump is the president, of course, they have become the attack news outlet. Really kind of interesting. But the problem is, of course, that a lot of times if somebody gets too much support, they think that they can do no wrong. And we've seen this over and over and over again in just about every administration that we've had in the last 50, 60 years. And that's known as groupthink, where they think that they can do nothing wrong. And it's based on group cohesiveness and solidarity. It's more important than considering the facts in a realistic manner. In other words, everybody has to follow the leader. That's the idea. Everybody has to follow the leader. The leader's ideas are always right. Sounds like a cult, doesn't it? That's exactly what a cult does, especially if we have a charismatic leader. And of course, right now, that's kind of what's going on as far as Donald Trump is concerned. He keeps losing members of his administration because they try to argue with him. And if they try to argue with him, he gets rid of them. That's what just happened with Rex Tillerson. Rex Tillerson was the Secretary of State. He was doing an okay job, but Donald Trump wants to run things all by himself. It's really kind of interesting. It's going to be interesting to see how this all turns out. Groupthink is most likely to occur when the group is highly cohesive, and of course that's the problem that Donald Trump is having right now. He can't put together a group of people that do everything that he wants them to do, that agrees with everything that he says. If he has somebody that is that kind of a follower, like Hope Hicks was, then all of a sudden he will do something that she doesn't like, and she quits, and that's what happened with Hope Hicks. He fired her boyfriend. Rob Porter was her boyfriend. And he fired him because the guy, turns out the guy was an abusive husband. So he fired him, and the next thing we know, Hope Hicks is out the door as well. Mainly because she was a very loyal follower. She said anything that Trump wanted her to say. And of course, once Rob Porter was out the door, then Hope couldn't agree with what was going on. Isolated from contrary opinions, in other words, and that's actually what's happening as far as the news outlets are concerned. Fox News says what Donald Trump wants them to say, so they're the good news outlet, and MSNBC and CNN, of course, are the bad guys. So what does he call CNN and MSNBC? What does he call their news? He refers to them as fake news. They're the fake news outlets. And since Fox News is saying what he wants them to say, they're the good news outlet. So he is isolating himself from contrary opinions. Or is he? I guess that's the other question. It's ruled by a directive leader who makes his or her wishes known, and of course that's Donald Trump in a nutshell. He's a very directive leader. While more authoritarian governments commonly participate in groupthink, occurrences in American history include Pearl Harbor. One of the reasons Pearl Harbor was so devastating for the American military was because the leaders were fighting the past war. They were preparing for World War I. They weren't really preparing for a new war against a new enemy. And of course, they didn't believe that somebody would attack them without telling them that they were going to attack. Hi Wilson, how you doing? Not that bad, huh? Okay. Good. And that's what happened at Pearl Harbor. So one of the things that happened was that the military was warned that the Japanese might attack, and as a matter of fact, they were looking for the attack group. A group of aircraft carriers were out there. They knew that they were out there, and they didn't know where they were. They couldn't find them. And this kind of stuff happens all the time. It's happening right now in Korea. We play war games with the South Koreans all the time, and of course, every time we do that, the North Koreans claim that we're about to attack them. And the reality is, well, this is the way they do things in Asia. They sneak attack, and that's just the way they do things. So anytime that we practice attacking somebody or practice defending somebody, they claim that we're about to attack them. But that's exactly what the Japanese did. We knew that was taking place. But so our ideas were, well, let's get all the planes as close to each other as we can. Let's put all the ships as close to each other as we can. That way it'll be harder for them to hit individual ships. Well, that's not what happened, of course. When they came in and they strafed and bombed, it was very easy for them to destroy all of our planes because they were all right next to each other. I mean, if we had them spread out, they would have had to have shot this airplane, and then they would have had to have flown over here and shot this airplane. But they didn't do that. We had them all lined up, so they just went down the line and blew them all up. They just destroyed all the planes. Okay, so what should have happened was we should have been smarter, and we should have spread things out a little bit more. That's what should have happened, but that's not what happened at all. Bay of Pigs invasion, you guys don't know about the Bay of Pigs. It happened during the Kennedy administration. It happened 61? Yeah, it was in 61. You don't remember 61. When were you born?
66. No.
Yeah, so you're minus 5 years old. The Vietnam War, and of course I was in the Vietnam War, so I can talk about the Vietnam War. Watergate was taking place while I was in the military, so I'm very much aware of what was going on. Anyway, these were all cases of groupthink, and I'll explain them right now. The Bay of Pigs, Castro took over in Cuba in 1959. He overthrew the Batista government. Batista government was very corrupt. I mean, it was extremely corrupt. So it wasn't a bad thing that the Batista government left Cuba. When they left Cuba, of course, there were a lot of people that fled to the United States. And these were the Cuban immigrants, and there were a lot of them. There were several 100,000 of them, and most of them settled as close to Cuba as they could possibly get. And that turned out to be Miami. Well, Miami turned into a smoldering pot with all these Cuban immigrants in it. And they were all saying, well, you know, the Castro government's weak, the Castro government has no power, the people really don't want Castro to be in power, they like it the way it was, not the way it is. So if we go back in there, we can just, all we need to do is make a show of taking over the government, and the people will rise up behind us. That's what they were saying. And of course, this made a lot of sense to the new president, President Kennedy. Actually, it made a lot of sense to the old president, which was, who was the old president? That was Eisenhower. So the Eisenhower administration, they were supporting this. They were supporting all these immigrants. In essence, what was actually going on was that they were trying to shut them up. They were trying to get them to shut up. And so they were allowing them to make all these plans and whatnot. Well, once the Kennedy administration, but there were individuals in the CIA who were in support of invading Cuba. There were people in the CIA that were in support of that. As soon as Kennedy took over, of course, Eisenhower was a Republican. As soon as Kennedy took over, there was a change of ideas. And when there was a change of ideas, they went to Kennedy and they said, well, this has been in the works for a long time. We've been planning this ever since, you know, before Castro took over. We've been planning this whole thing. And he said, okay. And he allowed it to happen. He allowed the CIA to talk him into it. The CIA actually supported the invasion, but it was an abysmal failure. The people were very happy that the communists had taken over. There was no general uprising. There were no people in Cuba that were on their side, and so these guys were kind of all by themselves. And they were, for the first couple days, they got air support from the CIA. And then Kennedy said, you know, stop. We're not seeing what they said that we were going to see. So they stopped, and of course the invasion collapsed at that point. And all these people were captured. And some of them were put to death, but most of them were sent back to the United States. So they were immigrants. What was the groupthink? The groupthink was that there was nobody telling Kennedy, don't do this. There's nobody saying, well, maybe this isn't a good idea. The people at the CIA that were against it were not allowed to speak. The individuals, it was a brand new administration. This is in 1961. He was inaugurated in February, and this took place in the summer. So he'd only been president for about 5 or 6 months. And his cabinet wasn't even complete at that point. So there was nobody to argue against it. What do I have next? Watergate. Watergate, this destroyed the Nixon administration. The reason they call it Watergate was because there was a Watergate complex in Washington, D.C., and that's where the Democratic headquarters was. It was in the Watergate. The Republicans decided that, that the best thing for them to do is to find out what the Democrats were up to. They were afraid that they were using shady means to be elected in the next election. And of course, Nixon wasn't a very popular president at the time. There was a lot of anti-war stuff going on, and they seemed to be aiming it all at Nixon, which upset Nixon because he had inherited the war from Johnson. Johnson had been the president. It seemed to be a Democratic war. It was started by Kennedy. It was expanded by Johnson, and here he was. He ran in 1968. He ran on a platform of ending the war, and but he wasn't given really much of an opportunity to end the war. So he was really upset. This is in 1972, and he decided that the Democrats were using. Maybe they had been infiltrated by the communists. Maybe they had been infiltrated by the peace movement. Maybe they had been infiltrated by the civil rights movement. So he decided that he was going to bug the Democratic headquarters. And so he did. He got ex-CIA agents and operatives from overseas to come in and bug the headquarters. And they bugged it for a number of weeks, maybe months. We're not exactly sure how long they had it bugged. But one night they went in, it stopped working, and they went in to fix it, and they got caught. And at that point, of course, they found the bug, and it was very obvious that the Republicans had done this. So the question was, how much did Nixon know about what was going on? Well, he claimed he didn't know anything. And then it turned out, of course, through months of investigation, he was re-elected the president, and he won by a landslide. He won by a lot. But he lost his presidency because he lied about colluding in the bugging of the Democratic headquarters, which isn't fair on any way you look at it. It wasn't really fair. So anyway, he lost his presidency. He had to resign. But all of his advisors were telling him, "Don't tell the truth. Keep lying. Keep trying to hide all this information." And of course, that's what destroyed him. That's the Watergate. So all of his, and we're going to talk more about the Watergate in just a second. Iran-Contra was really kind of interesting. This is, maybe you remember this. This happened, well, of course, some of you are so young, you can't possibly remember this. Ronald Reagan was the president. He was elected in 1980. He was president through 1988. He was a very popular president. He won his re-election by more than just about anybody in the history of the United States. So he's a very popular president. He surrounded himself with people that told him how wonderful he was. He thought he could do no wrong. He thought he could do anything that he wanted. Well, at the time, the Iranians were fighting against the Iraqis. The Iraq-Iran war was taking place. And that started about 1980, and it ended about 1989 or 1990. So they had this really bloodthirsty war was taking place between the Iranians and the Iraqis. Well, if you remember, the Iranians had seized our diplomats and seized all of our military property when they overthrew the Shah back in 1978. Yeah, they overthrew the Shah in 1978. And I know all of this because I was stationed with the son of the Shah of Iran, which is really kind of fascinating. And he lived right upstairs. My wife lived on the bottom floor, and he lived on the second floor. So he always had to walk past my wife. So, of course, he had all these minions. He had the Secret Service was there guarding him. He had a armored car that he would drive around in. It was an armored Jaguar, gold Jaguar. And it was armor plated, bulletproof glass. It had armor plating in the doors. The thing weighed a ton. So one time it rains in Lubbock, Texas, from time to time, and the dirt is really sandy. So it rained this one time, and it was sitting out in a low spot, and it got stuck. They couldn't get it out. So I happened to be there talking with my wife. Not, she wasn't my wife at the time. We weren't even supposed to be dating. But so I was there and I said, here, I'll help you. I'm thinking, of course, it's just a car, right? I could pick up a car and move it out. That thing was so heavy. I mean, there were like 10 of us trying to push this thing out. And it must have weighed a couple tons. It was really heavy. It was extreme. And it was a little bitty Jaguar. It was just a 2-seat Jaguar. But it was armor plated. Anyway, why am I talking about this? Oh yeah, Iran Contra. Okay, so the deal was that the Iranians ran out of parts for all the stuff that they stole from us back when they overthrew the Shah. You know, eventually they thought that they were going to win this war really fast because they had all of this American equipment. But eventually the equipment broke down. So they needed parts for all their military things. And of course, they had just seized our diplomats. They held them for 333 days. It was really an ugly situation. So we're really pissed off at the Iranians. As well we should be, since they had overthrown the Shah and they had seized all of they seized like $4 billion worth of stuff. I had a friend that he had the Air Force account. He was the one that ran the Air Force account for Iran in Germany, and he lost $4 billion. They seized like $14 billion worth of stuff. Anyway, so they decided that the Iranians needed parts. What time is it? Okay. The Iranians needed parts. Well, at the same time, Nicaragua had gone left. They had elected a Marxist government, and the government was called the Sandinistas. And Reagan didn't like it because these guys were not right wing. They were left wing. They were communist. So there was a group that started in Guatemala that called themselves the Contras, and Contra in Spanish just means against. So they referred to themselves as this long Spanish name, but what it meant was that they were against the communists in Nicaragua. So the Contras were this slipshod group of individuals that every once in a while would wander down into Nicaragua and kill a goat and run back. So here they were terrorists, right? In Nicaragua. So the government decided, the Congress decided that, which was controlled by the Democrats, Congress decided that they weren't going to allow Reagan to support the Contras. At one point, Reagan actually said in a speech, "I am a Contra." In other words, I'm against the Sandinista government. But the Congress put a block on him sending them any money. Are you getting the picture? So he can't support the Contras. The Iranians are our enemies because they've seized all of these assets. And they're fighting a war against the Iraqis. And at the time, we were supporting the Iraqis. I know this is an ugly picture. This is where Saddam Hussein comes in. Because we're the ones that put Saddam Hussein in power. Why? Because he was willing to fight against the Iranians. International politics. Eventually we had to go in and take out Saddam Hussein, right? But we are the ones that put Saddam Hussein in power, as strange as that may sound. Okay, so this is all taking place. Iran's the bad guys, Contra's the good guys as far as the Reagan administration is concerned. So what he decided to do, or what this guy decided to do, this is Oliver North. Oliver North was a Marine lieutenant colonel. So he put together this deal where he was taking spare American parts for the military equipment in Iran. And he was going to sell it to the Iranians for cash. Then he was going to take that cash and he was going to give it to the Contras. Yeah, okay. So he stole parts from the United States, sold it to the Iranians for cash, and he took the cash and he gave it to this group that he wasn't supposed to give any money to. That's what's going on. Now, why in the world did they allow that to happen? Everybody in the Reagan administration knew what was going on. And they almost got away with it. But the reason they didn't get away with it was because somebody threatened Oliver North. And so he decided that he was going to take some of that Iran-Contra money, and he was going to put a security around his own house because he had been threatened by, I don't know, the Iraqis or somebody. Somebody threatened him. So he put like a $15,000 security system around his house. And that's how he got caught. They found out about that security system that he put up around his house. They started looking into it and they realized it was from the cash that came out of the Iran, from Iran. And then they tried to find the cash and they couldn't find it, and they realized, or then they traced it all the way down to the Contras. Is this a pretty picture? But there was nobody telling anybody no. Did Reagan know? Well, according to Oliver North, he didn't. But there were other members of the administration that did know. The Secretary of Defense knew, for example. Anyway, so groupthink was taking place in this case as well. And of course, Oliver North was an acolyte. He's a conservative talk show host now on the radio. And of course, he's a hero to all the Reaganites. Reagan, of course, this was like in 1986. Reagan left office in 1988. But there was a lot of money that changed hands, and it was a real interesting situation. I don't know if you remember the Clinton and Lewinsky affair, but of course this is coming up now that there are people that are accusing Donald Trump of having sex with them, who weren't married, who haven't been married to Donald Trump, and evidently it's been in the last, I don't know, how long has he been married to Melania? 10 years? Barron's 10 years old, so I guess they've been married for 10 or 11 years. So this is coming up.
12 years.
I'm sorry?
It's 12 years.
They've been married for 12 years? Is he 12? Barron's 12?
Barron is 11, but it takes, what?
9 months to...
Yeah, so...
After you get
12
married?
years.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm just wondering, okay. So Bill Clinton was president of the United States. Bill Clinton had a history of philandering. He theoretically, well, and we don't know, who knows? How much sex was he having with women other than Hillary? Monica Lewinsky was a 21-year-old intern at the White House. Evidently she seduced him, or he allowed himself to be seduced by this lady that threw herself at him. And of course, this is Monica Lewinsky. She has a PhD in history now, I know, and she lives in England. Not important. Anyway, so she's having this affair, and her best friend is Linda Tripp. This is Linda Tripp right here. And so she calls her on the telephone, and Linda Tripp was recording all these stories. And of course, Lewinsky was complaining that Bill Clinton wasn't going to leave his wife, and he didn't really love her, and they weren't really having sex. Well, they were having sex, but it wasn't genital sex. He didn't allow her to have genital sex with him, and it was, that kind of a situation. Anyway, so Linda Tripp was taping him. Well, in Washington D.C., it's against the law to tape somebody unless you tell them that you're taping them. That's the law. And here she was taping Monica Lewinsky without telling her. So the question was, what's going to happen next? And what did happen next was that the Clinton administration started lying about what was going on. And of course, he was almost impeached because he continued to lie about all this stuff. And of course, there was nobody to tell him that he was wrong. He was convinced that this is the only way to get away with this. And eventually, he missed being impeached by one vote. So he was very lucky that he maintained his presidency. Symptoms of groupthink. One symptom of groupthink is an illusion of invulnerability, causing group members to overestimate their group's might and right. The captain of the Titanic had once said God himself could not sink this ship. On April 14th, 1912, while still on the ship's first voyage, the Titanic struck an iceberg and sank. Only 711 people out of 2,224 people survived the sinking of the Titanic. They thought it was so invulnerable they didn't put enough lifeboats on the ship for everybody. And that's one of the reasons that so few people survived. Symptoms of groupthink. Another symptom is an unquestioned belief in the group's morality, which also leads to overestimation of power. During the Watergate cover-up, Nixon and his advisors had several opportunities to admit their collusion, but just kept trying to hide their deeds. And since they wouldn't admit it, eventually it came out that they were lying. And it turned out that they were all liars. Nixon knew. Not only that, but all of his advisors knew. And of course, 7 of these individuals went to prison. 7 of his advisors went to prison. Now, the interesting thing about these 7 advisors, of those 7 advisors, 2 of them became evangelical preachers after they came out of prison. 2 of them did. I know. The rest of them became conservative talk show hosts, which is also kind of interesting. But they thought that they were right. And they thought that they were doing the moral thing. So sometimes might makes right. The group tends to discount challenges by collectively rationalizing their decisions. When talking about escalating the Vietnam War, President Johnson held weekly Tuesday lunches discussing the war. This is his famous Tuesday lunch. And he would bring people in to talk about the war. Well, what happened in these meetings, instead of talking about ending the war, talking about whether this is a just war or not, all they did was rationalize the fact that they were fighting the damn war. And so here they had these meetings. For 6 years they had these meetings. And nobody talked about ending the war. They just kept talking about expanding the war. How are we going to win? How are we going to win? So instead of talking about stopping it, they just talked about continuing it. And of course, it was them rationalizing. They became rationalization sessions instead of actual discussions about what was going on in the war. The group tends to stereotype their opponent as weak and unintelligent and incapable of legitimate retaliation. This is what happened in Iraq. We invaded Iraq. We knew we were going to win the war. We knew that we were going to win, that we were going to overthrow the Saddam Hussein government. That wasn't difficult. That wasn't the difficult part. So if that was our goal, why didn't we just leave after we overthrew the Iraqi government? What happened next? Why couldn't we leave?
Stuck on oil.
Was it oil?
Or it could be...
Was it the Iraqi oil that we were after? The Iraqis really don't have that much oil. It's Kuwait that has all the oil. The Iraqis were stealing Kuwaiti oil. So what happened next? What happened next was a religious war kicked up between the Shia and the Sunni. We didn't even know that there were 2 branches of Islam. We thought that they were just, we referred to them in negative terms. I was talking to a couple of Iraqi war veterans upstairs, and they were referring to these individuals in negative terms. We were talking about these individuals like they were Bedouins, riding around on camels. That's one of the derogatory terms that they were referred to as. Camel jockeys. Are they camel jockeys? Hell no, they're not camel jockeys. These people have AK-47s. They have RPGs. They build IEDs and plant them in the road. And they kill lots of Americans that way. All of a sudden, we were literally in between the Shia and the Sunni, and they were fighting against each other. But that's the Iraq War. The example that I give is that the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban immigrants had actually convinced JFK that the Cuban military was weak and it was ill-equipped. Well, he equipped the United States actually equipped the Cuban army. That was before, and we were sending them arms and ammunition before the Batista government was overthrown. So we knew that they had all this equipment, but he was convinced that they were ill-equipped and they were weak. They also argued that the popular support in Cuba would be so great that there would be a general uprising. Of course, it collapsed in 2 days, and it collapsed as soon as we stopped supporting them. As soon as we stopped giving them air support. Because what was happening, the Cuban military was moving in to put down the uprising, and the CIA Air Force was bombing them and keeping them from overrunning the invaders. And as soon as the air support was gone, the invasion was gone. Pressures toward uniformity. Of course, these individuals want to conform, and there are always pressures to conform, so they will ridicule, and not listen to individuals who argue against it. As a matter of fact, they'll kick them out. And that's kind of what's happening with Trump right now. He's getting rid of people that don't agree with him. So all you have to do is tell him one time. I was watching, I don't know if you guys remember Gary Shandling. Gary Shandling was a comedian. And it turns out that he put together all these shows, and on these shows, if you disagreed with Gary Shandling, he would fire you, and he would fire you right away. All you had to do was say no, and he would go, "Well, you're fired." And so he was kind of one of these type of individuals. He wouldn't allow anybody to disagree with him. He'd just get rid of them. Well, that's kind of what's happening right now in the administration. It's really kind of fascinating to watch as a political scientist, my other occupation. Self-censorship is practiced by the members to prevent ridicule, of course, since they don't want to be argued down or told how stupid they are, and they won't allow themselves to say anything negative. During the preparation for the Challenger flight, Thiokol engineer George McDonald wanted to postpone the flight. He said it's too cold. These O-rings will freeze, and if they get too cold, they won't be flexible enough to hold the fuel in. But instead of clearly stating, "I recommend we don't launch below 53 degrees, he offered an equivocal opinion. He suggested that lower temperatures are in the direction of badness, for both O-rings. What did he think they should do? From this tempered words, of course, it's hard to tell. And this is what happened in the Challenger. I don't know if you guys were even alive when the Challenger. There we go. Do you remember? I was watching it. I was down drawing blood down in the pediatrics clinic at the Children's Hospital in Omaha, and I was down there drawing blood, and they had this on television. So one of the reasons they don't televise them anymore. I mean, everybody was shocked because this thing takes off, and all of a sudden you get this explosion, and things go off in different directions. And of course, all these kids were watching it. Of course, they didn't understand what was going on. I'm watching it. I got an eye on the television. I'm drawing blood from this little kid, and all of a sudden it exploded. I just about dropped my needle. That would have been cute, dropping my needle in some kid's arm. No, I'm a professional. I went ahead and finished my blood draw. And they didn't admit what had happened right away. They said, "Well, this doesn't look good." That's what they said. Yeah. Eventually, of course, it all came out. They realized, whoops, something's not going up anymore. It's kind of going out. Quite a mess. Because there is a little opposition within the group, there is an illusion of unanimity. And of course, that's the biggest problem. The reason that Watergate was such a big scandal was because somebody in the group dropped a dime on those guys. And it turned out to be the wife of one of them. So the husband was coming home and telling his wife what was going on. Well, she was appalled at the fact that these people were hiding this, and it was a continual cover-up that was taking place. And because of that, she's the one that dropped the dime on it. She was the person they called Deep Throat, which, of course, has other connotations now, but at the time she was deep throat, which is kind of interesting. The group tends to protect the group from information that would call into question the effectiveness or morality of their decisions, and these individuals are known as mind guards. So we see these in the two news groups that we have in the United States. We have the conservative news group, and then we also have the less conservative news group, which is CNN and CBS News and NBC News and MSNBC. The conservative right has several mouthpieces that defended every action taken by the Republican administration in general and George W. Bush in particular. Fox News, of course, that's Stone Phillips. Is that what his name is? Stone Phillips? Isn't that Stone? I don't know. I never watched it. But he's this pretty guy. He's this real attractive. Rush Limbaugh is another one. And Pat Buchanan, of course, he's not on the radio anymore. But Pat Buchanan and Rush Limbaugh were the mouthpieces for the conservative group. Fox News, of course, the conservative right is also supporting Donald Trump, which is really kind of interesting. The question is, will the evangelical right abandon him, since with all this information coming out about Stormy Daniels, and she's the porno star. The other one is Karen McDonald, I can't remember. Anyway, she's the Playboy bunny that theoretically had an affair with him. So the question is, what will happen next? It's really kind of fascinating to watch, or not. So how do you avoid groupthink? A wise leader can take several steps to avoid groupthink. They can remain impartial. They can seek outside opinions. They can create subgroups. They can seek anonymous opinions. A study by L.H. Chin in 2000 showed that death rates nearly doubled for 16 to 17-year-old drivers when they had 2 passengers rather than none. Were they more willing to take chances when others were egging them on and someone to show off for? And this is known as the risky shift. As interesting as that is. Fortunately, President Kennedy learned from his mistakes from the Bay of Pigs decision, and when he encountered his next major foreign policy decision, the Cuban Missile Crisis, he took many of these steps to avoid groupthink. And of course, this could have ended up in World War III. It looked like it might end up as World War III, because we knew that the Russians were putting missiles, atomic nuclear warheads in Cuba. And of course, Cuba's only 90 miles away from the United States. So with missiles in Cuba, they could actually target any city in the United States.
Did they get rid of them?
That's the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the question is, did they get rid of them? And the answer is yes, they did get rid of them. Because it looked like it was this guy, Nikita Khrushchev, versus John F. Kennedy. And the question is, who's going to blink first? Now, he claimed that what he was going to do, they were it's not my wine. Okay. So the question was, they were resupplying the Cubans. There were Russian missile experts in Cuba. They were setting up the firing ranges or firing areas, the missile sites. So they could have supplied Cuba with nuclear weapons, and they could have, of course, it would have looked bad for the United States. And potentially could have started World War III. Well, Kennedy said, we're going to stop any Russian vessel coming to Cuba. We're going to stop them, and we're going to search the ships to find out if they have missiles on them. And of course, that's an act of war. That's piracy. You can't do that. We can't. It's in international waters. You have the freedom to sail around as much as you want. That's one of the reasons why if you want to break a law, All you need to do is leave U.S. territorial waters, and whatever the laws in the United States, it's no good out there. So the federal government, the United States, has no right to stop somebody on the open seas. But we said we were going to do that. And of course, that's an act of war. So that's a threat of war. We told them that if they don't remove their missiles, then we're going to start seizing their vessels. And if they have any nuclear weapons or anything like that on them, then we're going to seize them. That's what we said. And then we said, and if you don't remove the missiles that are there now, we're going to bomb them. We're going to destroy them. Which is also an act of war. Just threatening to do that is an act of war. Amen. So what happened? Well, obviously we didn't have World War III. Nikita Khrushchev pulled out his missiles. And he turned all the Russian ships around. The reality was that even though that we had always said that the Russians could destroy the United States with their nuclear weapons, they really weren't prepared for war. Not at that point. As a matter of fact, they probably were never prepared for war. They bluffed us. They told us they showed a better hand than they actually had, or they claimed that they had a better hand than they actually had. So this is one of the realities of the Cold War. When his advisors met to decide what to do about the discovery of Soviet missiles in Cuba, Kennedy often absented himself from the group so as not to inhibit discussion. He wanted them to talk. He wanted them to talk openly. And he knew that if he was in the room, they would try to agree with him. So he would leave so that these individuals would talk. And of course, he's talking about military people. The problem with military people is that they are trained to follow orders. But what if they're the one in charge? Well, their entire military career, they have been trained to follow orders. So how are you going to get ideas from military people? Are they allowed to have their own ideas? Well, they're not allowed to have their own ideas until they're in charge. So what for 25 years we've conditioned you not to shut up, and now all of a sudden we need you to talk. Can you talk? And the answer was, of course, they needed to take out the positions of authority. As long as Kennedy wasn't there, as long as the vice president wasn't there, as long as the secretary of defense wasn't there, the generals could actually talk. And that's when they figured out what they could do. The way the military works is they always say that they can do something. And you know, that's just the mindset of military people. Kennedy brought in outside experts, for example, Adlai Stevenson, who were not members of the in-group. That Kennedy successfully negotiated the removal of the Soviet missiles was almost certainly due to the improved methods of group decision making that he adopted. It was the fact that he didn't allow groupthink to take place again. So we were successful. The Russians did pull out their missiles. The Russians did turn their ships around. There are no nuclear weapons in Cuba today. And the reason there are no nuclear weapons is because Kennedy called Khrushchev's bluff. Khrushchev had already won during the Bay of Pigs. And he knew that he thought Kennedy was weak. And because of that, he didn't think that he had the resolve to actually go to the brink of war. And there are movies, I guess, there are select movies that are about being on the brink of war during the Cuban Missile Crisis. We were really, really close to attacking the Russians. And of course, if we had attacked the Russians, we'd sunk any of their ships. If we had actually bombed Cuba, then it would have been World War III. And if you understand what was going on in 1961, half of Europe was communist, and the other half of Europe wasn't. Of course, we were supporting the part that wasn't. The part that was would have gone to war with the Russians. They would have supported the Russians. And of course, it would have been World War III and quite a mess, unfortunately. Okay, why don't we stop right here and we'll pick this up next time in group polarization. I know I told a lot of stories today. I apologize. Political science, I just find it fascinating.